being held in two parts. So we've got 2 hours with you this morning from 10 to noon. And then we've got an afternoon session tomorrow from 1 to 3 p.m. Hopefully everyone was able to work through the WebEx kind of login and registration process. And as we always do, we will record the meeting. So just want to notice everyone about that. And we'll post it on YouTube roughly 2 weeks once we've got that downloaded and the work that is required to get that uploaded to YouTube. We're going to keep everyone muted for the duration of the meeting, but if you want to ask a question, please do type in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand function to be unmuted and to share your comments. We do want to encourage participation, but manage the noise in the background that comes from having folks unmuted. If you're calling in just by phone rather than on the WebEx application, I think you can press *9 to raise your hand. And if you're having any technical difficulties as we go, one of our staff is available and on with us for technical support, Ryan Castle, and you can email him. His email, is it on the screen here? It doesn't look like we have it on the screen, but we'll put it into the chat. He's ryan.castle@dot.ca.gov. And I've got his phone number here, 916-594-3625. We'll make sure to share that out so folks can get a hold of Ryan if you're having any challenges. So just to quickly review the agenda for today, this morning's portion, we're going to focus on updates and opportunities with the federal bipartisan infrastructure law, either IJA or bill, the two different acronyms floating around. So we're kind of using them interchangeably, but we're going to give an update on that and the working group that Yachtman has been leading. And then we're also going to talk about freight investments, and we've got Giles and Avital both joining us from CalSTA, who are going to be presenting and leading that discussion with me this morning. So lots of robust discussion to get into this morning, and then tomorrow when we reconvene for our second portion on day 2, we're going to hear, I believe, from CTC about Senate Bill 671 and the California Supply Chain Success Initiative, and have some time for discussion of those. So I think with that, I will stop my opening remarks and hand it over to Yachtman to lead us into the discussion about the bipartisan infrastructure law update.
Great. No, thank you, Jeannie. Can everybody hear me well?
Yep, you sound good.
I think before we start, Jeannie, I see that I'm getting some emails regarding somewhere logged in on Teams channel at CFAC. So, Allison and Riley, can you take a look at that just to make sure we have everybody at CFAC this meeting? So that'll be very helpful.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. While you're doing that in parallel, next, so I'll be talking about the bill, and as Jeannie mentioned, the new federal authorization and some of the freight overviews. And so please, for those who were able to join us at the first sub-working group meeting, a lot of this will be kind of repeat, but I do want to share this with the overall CFAC group here, because for those who haven't had a chance to join us, this is very useful and helpful information, especially for the freight component of the federal authorization. So next slide, please. So this is, again, this is a huge once in a lifetime, as we say, federal spending authorization with nearly $1.2 trillion, trillion dollars, including $555 billion in transportation, water, power, and infrastructure. There is a lot of stakeholders involved, like in all levels of government, including our tribal partners or local or physically, there is a lot more stakeholders involved than the previous authorization. And there is, as part of this larger working group, the IJA implementation working group, there are implementation action plans that we're looking to develop, and there is a significant number of meetings. We have been meeting since December. I know it doesn't seem too long ago, February, but no, we are meeting, and that's a larger working group. And while we know there are many sub-working groups as part of this larger working group that we are contributing to. Next slide. So a lot of materials, again, many of you probably have attended some of these working group meetings already. A lot of materials available at the CalSTA website, which you see here. There you'll find the resources available, some of the analysis that the state has reviewed and provided, working group meeting notes, materials, PowerPoints, just a lot of background material, as well as a number of USDOT notice of funding opportunities, as well as other federal notices. As we have their authorization, there are a number of dockets and codification that's kind of happening in real time, you say. So, you will find a lot of information available on our CalSTA website. As I had mentioned, part of this implementation working group, the larger part, there are action plans developed as part of these sub-working groups and again, larger working group. And so we look forward to working with our freight and as well as non-freight partners as well in these sub-working groups. Next slide, please. So there are, and I want to make sure that I know, I know there are a few, probably a little more than these ones here, but there are sub-working groups as part of the larger working group. Here a handful, and again, many of you are probably on these already. And so there is the overall freight funding split between state, local, across programs, reimagining highway investments. I believe that's Jeannie, you're leading this, right, Jeannie? Excellent, to be a very good discussion. Yep. Climate resilience and adaptation. Planning is also leading as well. Transition to zero emission. I know this is very dear to especially the freight industries. Desires and priorities. I believe Tony, our Deputy Director for Sustainability, is leading that with his team. Active transportation, of course, very important. Local hire contracting, commuter and intercity rail, and of course, freight and goods movement. Tribal government, transit safety, and fix it first. I'm not sure if I left off you again. This is kind of dynamic and kind of a little fluid, but we will surely provide that more information if there is anything missing from this list. Before I go on, are there any questions?
Yeah, and this is Jeannie, not a question, but I just wanted to add, there's been a lot of interest in all of these working groups. We're trying to, at Caltrans, sort of identify priorities and get the discussions kicked off in all these areas, because I know there's so much enthusiasm and interest and wanting to start the discussion. We do not have full information yet from the federal side on some of these programs. And, we're waiting for further action from Congress as well to release some of the funding. So we're in a bit of a holding pattern, trying to get some started and some we're sort of waiting to get more guidance and more information before we really do start the discussion. So just want to appreciate that we're getting a lot of requests. What's going on with this work group? What's going on with that one? How are you going to manage this process with all the work groups that folks are interested in? So, please be patient with us. We're trying to get as much information out to you as we have it. But also we want to be, hearing from folks if there's, things that you want us to be thinking about up front. Definitely want to encourage the outreach, but also just let folks know that, we're trying to kind of manage the process, not start all of these work groups at the same time, just given how much of a workload it is for our teams to, we're not, we don't have a lot of new resources yet to manage this process. So trying to kind of, balance that and also just balance the time on folks' schedules that want to be involved in lots of work groups. So anyway, I just add to what you were saying, there's a lot of change, a lot of new programs. So we're trying to roll it out like really as it makes sense based on the information and the priorities.
Oh, thank you, Jeannie. That's a great point. A lot of this is again happening in real time as we get more information from the feds. And so again, at least from the freight work group, and I'm sure the other work groups as well will be sharing that information as soon as we get it. There's a lot of digestion that needs to happen once we get this information. So no, thank you, Jeannie, for that reminder. If you get next slide, please. So as I mentioned, freight and Goods Movement sub-working group as part of the larger effort that is the CalSTA and Caltrans both partnering on to implement the new federal authorization. There is, before we had our kickoff meeting, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, we sent a survey to our freight sub-working group regarding what they deem as priorities, objectives, expectations, and maybe questions they may have for this to be involved in the sub-working group. I'm extremely appreciative of those who called in, who joined and contributed. We had about 50 plus partners that joined, ranging from our port partners to our MPO local partners, for advocacy groups as well as the rail partners. Just a very, very wide-ranging dynamic group that, very comprehensive. And so we really appreciate you investing time to chat with us, to provide input. Again, we provided a survey, really well received. We got a lot of really positive feedback, a lot of really useful information, and that really helped us frame the sub-working group. We want to make sure the sub-working group is very useful to our partners. So it's not just, Caltrans or, CalSTA. This is the state direction, right? We want to make sure that have a very engaging and meaningful, effort. The objectives that our partners identify, we want to make sure we enhance freight stakeholder engagement, identify state goals and priorities, working with our partners, and position California to maximize federal funding opportunities. I'll get into a little later, but there is a lot more funding available. Again, not just generally, but of course for freight. Again, speaking of freight here, there's infra has gone up. There is the federal formula dollars are up. There's a lot more. And also our partners expressed how do we go about implementing zero emission freight. That I know California is the leader in this, and we're doing a really good job. But how do we continue to be that leader in the space, right? This is, and I don't want to demean where passenger vehicles are a lot easier, but freight is extremely hard. And I think we all know this as we're practitioners doing this. So we want to see how California, the state itself, how we're going to partner with our partners to do so. And lastly, how we're going to enhance our CFAC, right? We do, I think California does a really good job in terms of engaging our freight partners, but we definitely could build this in a bigger space. I think we could share more information. As I mentioned, as federal information comes in rolling along, we'll definitely distribute that. We're thinking about a little more, maybe having more subcommittees for specific topics. And again, not a surprise, just thinking about the supply chain challenges that we're still experiencing, what are some ways that we could use CFAC better to, provide, for example, suggestions, recommendations, ideas amongst our partners to, help this component of our transportation system. Next. So again, we provide a survey. As I mentioned, we asked what the group's expected outcomes are, implementation needs for the state, potential challenges and risk, and then their priority sections in the federal authorization. Again, there's a lot for those who have had the luxury of diving into 1,000+ pages. This is extremely important. There's a lot of information, and again, I'm really, really excited that there is a lot of positive feedback and input in terms of what our partners are prioritizing. So again, very helpful for the working group. Next slide, please. So the expected outcomes, our partners express collaboration, again, best practices, data sharing, shared funding. I'm going to get into a little bit of data sharing here. Freight data is extremely difficult and challenging. Again, not a surprise for us, again, practitioners. So, we want to understand how we could do that better. I know some of our MPO partners and larger partners may have data that they kind of procure, they're using, one kind of best practices of it. I also have discussions at FHWA. Other states have expressed the data and the technical challenges that have been trying to get this, especially for smaller states. It's extremely expensive and resource intensive. So we want to make sure that in at least California, working with federal partners, what we could do better in that space. Very dear to many of your hearts. I think we spoke to this at the last freight plan update. Statewide freight strategy for prioritization. Again, there is a lot of funding, a lot of discretionary funding and formula funding coming in. How do we prioritize, again, not just the freight component, and while this is freight centric, how do we prioritize funding, right? We want to, again, I know many of our partners too are understanding that a big a significant amount of NOFOs coming out concurrently. There's a lot of things coming, so we want to understand how we do prioritization better. And state partnership, sponsorship process for freight eligible programs. How we as a state work with the partners in terms of what projects will be the best suited as we move forward. And lastly, univoice. And this is not new. Univoice for statewide goods movement. California is humongous. We have significant amount of imports and exports, so we want to make sure that our voices are unified, continue to be unified as we project, to our federal partners what the needs are for California. Next slide, please. So I'm going to touch on this very quickly here, and as some of you guys may be familiar, and this is a really good refresher for those who have been involved in the last freight plan update, as well as refresh or new information for those who are newer to this component of CFAC. This is the FAST Act requirement for state freight plans. And what it is here, these are 10 elements that in the previous authorization were required as part of state freight plans. Quickly touching upon here, freight system trends, needs, issues, policies, multimodal, critical urban, multimodal critical rural freight, facilities and corridors, rural and urban freight corridors, national multimodal freight policy goals. And there's again, I don't want to just read from the slides here, but there is a lot of elements that were a part of the last FAST Act requirements for freight plan. And for those who had a chance to be a part of that last cycle, again, we really appreciate your support and input. It is pretty extensive. I think about 600-ish pages. This is a lot of content in freight. And so I just want to share that with you because as we get into the new authorization, next slide. There is a lot more. Up in the state freight plan in the previous authorization, we were required to update it every 5 years, and now we're required to update it every 4 years. So that is significant time compression, considering the fact that there hasn't been guidance right now from the feds yet, as well as there's just a lot of moving pieces. So all of our states, our partners, state agencies are very nervous about the implementation because again, very short timeline, but we will expedite as much as we can working with the CFAC here. Freight forecast increased from I think 5 years to now 8 years, and that, from my understanding, is more aligned with the STIP and the RIPS and the tips, ITIPs. Again, as I mentioned, 7 new elements compared to the 10. Now I'm going to quickly highlight them here. And again, there isn't any specific guidance at the moment, right? And so this is what's in the bill itself. And our state, as well as other states, are really trying to figure out, what's expected. We did provide some comments to our Fed partners in freight, and so we're waiting for some direction on this as well. But again, this is not where we're going to sit still and wait. We do anticipate working with you guys to formulate what we think these new elements may be and how to approach them. So, and again, it's kind of dynamic. We're working with you guys, but also anticipating direction from the feds. So I'm going to quickly go over some of these bullets here. Most recent, truck parking needs. So most recent commercial motor vehicle parking facility assessment. Most recent supply chain cargo flows in the state by mode. This is quite challenging. And again, it may be very different because of the recent COVID events that we've been having. So again, we don't know what to expect yet, but we'll work with Fed partners, inventory of commercial ports in the state, and then applicable multi-state freight compacts. This is something where California has been involved with our partner states or adjacent states. We're working with Nevada and Utah on I-15. Oh, sorry, Nevada and Utah on I-15 work, as well as we've been working with, as well as Nevada, with the Winter Coalition work as well on I-80. And there's also, I believe, an ongoing effort on I-15 or I-10 with Arizona and more of the states on that side. So there's a lot of stuff kind of happening in freight as well. And so, part of that multi-state compact is very important in the freight plans. Consideration of military freight. Apologies, I kind of missed one there. Impact of e-commerce on freight infrastructure. This one is very tricky. E-commerce is growing, as you guys may know, experience. So we want to understand what's kind of expected there. We know it's a lot of information data that we have to consider. And lastly, strategies and goals to decrease severity of impact to extreme weather, natural disaster. This is something that we're working towards right now. We have a freight resilience scope of work that's kind of in draft form that we will share with CFAC as soon as it's kind of more ready, available. Again, this is something, and climate change and weather impacts are just significant impacts of freight. So we know we're very cognizant of these implications. Next slide. That's it. So I'm going to go back. So I'm wondering if anybody has any questions, Allison or Riley?
So just a reminder, if you have a question, you can either type it in the chat or use the raise your hand function. If you're calling in on your phone, please press *9 to raise your hand. And if you are calling in on your phone, we can't see your name. So Nicole, if you're here, if you could please press *9 so I can unmute you. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe just for some of the discussion here with the CFAC members, will you talk a little bit about just what we heard from the group in the first meeting? I know there was a lot of interest, zero emission infrastructure was a top priority for the group. We also heard a lot about sort of equity and impacts. And then of course, just this opportunity ahead of us, how do we sort of prioritize what the best investments really will be for the state? So will you, share just a little bit? I know many of the folks on CFAC were on the work group, but I just want to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page with what we feel like we heard and maybe what are going to be some of the priorities for discussion in the next meeting of the work group.
Great, no, great point. Thanks, Jeannie. So, and as I mentioned, there are a few, we're looking to stand up a few more meetings from now until May. And again, some of the topics we talked about was the medium-heavy ZEV implementation, the freight and equity component, the economic competitiveness of freight in California, investment strategy. Those are the higher topics or higher level priorities our partners have mentioned. So what that means is that we are grouping some of these themes together. We're going to invest our next meetings to talk about how do we go approach with the action plan or actions to strengthen or assess these needs. I think and my apologies, I should have this up on a slide, but there was a meeting scheduled for Thursday, and we're pushing that out to next week. As you guys see, there's a lot of sub-working groups are happening, and there's just a lot of moving parts from the feds. We're getting more and more information on a daily basis, and so one thing that we are trying to assess, how do we kind of cross collaborate with other sub-working groups, and especially the ZEV space. Now, as I mentioned, our deputy director, Tony Dang, his team is working on the ZEV component, but no, it shouldn't be just passenger and then freight does its own thing, right? There's a lot of collaboration that needs to happen. And so, as his team, as we get more information, we're looking to, maybe do like a joint one. But again, there's a lot of moving parts, but there is going to be one for next week on Thursday. And I believe many of you are on those and hopefully got the invitation. If you're not, please feel free to let me know. For the next meeting, we're thinking about like a California freight network. And the reason why this is important is because it really relates to investments. It relates to a lot of the federal requirements for the national multimodal freight plan. There's a lot of connections to different pieces. So we're thinking for our next meeting, how do we think about and move towards a system definition? Again, this kind of came out in the last freight plan as well. And so it just checks a lot of boxes and really helps the state out in this authorization, as well as just more concise with our decisions.
Yaman, we did have a question come in the chat from Lachey Cobley. Lachey, I'm gonna unmute you now.
Thank you. I was just wondering if there was a participant list that could be shared for the sub-working group with the Freight's Good movement.
We can share that list. We have a pretty robust roster. I will make that available to the group. Thank you.
We have another question from Carrie Cartwright. Carrie, you're unmuted.
Hey, Gary.
Thanks. Hey, Yaman, Jeannie. One of the things related to the freight plans are kind of also relates directly to project prioritization, ultimately partnerships for grants, which is something that I have advocated through the Coalition of America's Gateways and Trade Corridors, is identification of key gateways and corridors, which I think collectively at the federal level, state level, been reluctant to do that. And short of identifying projects, I think it's important to identify those gateways and corridors. I mean, we have, the trade corridors for TCEP. Well, in reality, I think that could be reduced to truly the gateways and corridors. Yeah, that may seem very biased and on my part, but the data and the facts are what they are, the volumes are what they are. So, and the congestion issues are what they are. And, likewise, when we were developing these corridors as part of TCIF back in 2006, 2007, working with then the secretary and the Caltrans director, I think that's something that the Caltrans should take on, is try and identify that in a document in the CFMP.
Oh, thank you, Carrie. Yeah, I think this kind of definition of gateways and corridors. I believe this is, again, and this relates highly to our next sub-working group meeting, just the California Freight Network, right? What that means is because, again, it's a huge state. There's a lot of important assets we have. We want to know how to invest appropriately with your input, of course. So, Carrie, please, we do look forward to your contribution at the next sub-working group meeting. Very important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Allison?
I'm not seeing any other hands raised or anything else in the chat.
Great. No, thank you. So again, yes, many of you know me well, so please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Any questions, sub-working group, freight, I like talking about freight. So do not hesitate, okay, guys. Thank you for your time.
I apologize, Yatman. There's one more.
Sure.
This is from Steve Smith. It says, I may have missed it, but do you have a target date for an update to the CFMP?
Good question, Steve. So we're a little bit nervous about that too. So as you may know, California is a little bit odd in terms of how we do our freight plan process. And odd, I mean, is because we roll our federal formula dollars into our TCEP program. And so Allison, do me a favor, can you go back to the last slide? So in element 9 here, freight investment plan, so typically states put in how they want to use the national freight formula dollars into this element. But because we put it into a competitive process, there are times we have in the past provided addendums or amendments to the freight plan to meet this expectation in order to utilize the freight formula dollars. The reason why I mentioned this is because we need to work with the new USDOT multimodal freight office to understand where California stands when we submit our freight plan. Is it more of updating this element and then the new elements, or is it we have to do a new one? How does that work? So that's still, I don't have a good definition answer in terms of when that is, but crossing our fingers, we do have our full 4 years forward. And so we originally anticipate, and my team is working on a freight plan already in its outline, just getting a lot of studies, but we're anticipating 2024, maybe 2025. Again, that date is still fluid, but as you guys may know, this takes a lot to do this freight plan, so we are working on it now, but we anticipate sometime 24, 25. When something I didn't clarify earlier, and Steve, thanks for reminding me, is we are looking for federal guidance, and it's anticipated the state freight plan guidance will come out sometime in summer. And so we're aiming for probably fall to have a scope of work for C-Factor review in terms of how we're going to tackling our new freight plan. And so be on the lookout for that. But again, this is with the assumption everything goes really smooth, that we have the US DOT Multimodal Freight Office already up and running and providing the states with these guidances. Allison?
For real this time, that was the last question. So we are running a little bit ahead of schedule. Would you like to take a brief recess or just jump into the next topic?
No, let's go to the next topic. I think we might circle back to some discussion on this as we talk about the investments. So let's jump in. Hopefully folks are okay with that. We're only 35 minutes in, so I think we should keep going. And my apologies, but Allison, I think we talked about having Giles and Avital go first. So I see, okay. I saw my name on the title slide, and I think we're gonna have Giles go and Avital, and then I'll round out this item. So hopefully we can promote them to panelists. There, I see Giles.
And then Avital, since you're calling in on the phone, could you go ahead and hit *9? Oh, there we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
we
Can you
hear
guys
you.
hear me? Okay,
Yeah.
I am on WebEx, but my WebEx is frozen. I think I'm having internet issues, so I apologize.
No problem, Avital. We can hear you. Maybe we'll kick it to Giles first, and then we'll come to you, and maybe your internet issues will get resolved in the meantime. But we've been having some weird stuff going on. My internet's been a little funky this morning too, so hopefully everybody isn't having issues.
I think Avital was.
Go ahead.
I think Avital was going to do the presentation. I mean, unless you're unable to, Avital.
Yeah, no, I can do that. Yeah, so I'm going to cover for
Okay.
Calsta this morning, and then Giles is going to cover for me tomorrow. So you'll see my name on the agenda tomorrow afternoon. So we're just doing a little bit of a swap for Calsta. So it'll be me this morning and Giles this afternoon. So yeah, again, I apologize that you can't see me. Let me try. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all right. Sorry, having major issues over here. All right. Well, I do have a slide. Is the slide on the screen?
It is, yes.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. Apologies again for the technical difficulties. My name is Avital Barnea, and I'm the Deputy Secretary for Transportation Planning at Calsta. And I'm just going to share some information this morning with you about some of the things that we're working on at Calsta regarding freight. And what you see here on your screen is a slide about Governor Newsom's supply chain budget proposal. So on January 10th of this year, Governor Newsom released his state budget proposal, which lays out a bold plan to bolster the state's strong economic growth and make historic investments in our future here in California. We currently have a $45.7 billion surplus in the state, and accordingly, the governor's budget is built on this strong financial foundation, and it really prioritizes one-time spending over ongoing funding programs using this funding surplus. So this really gives us a unique opportunity to make some down payments on the kinds of investments that will help ensure California's prosperous future. Just in general for transportation, there is almost $15 billion in the governor's budget proposal to fund programs and projects. And of particular interest to this group, what you see on your screen is the Supply Chain Resilience and Port Investments Package, which is funded with $2.3 billion in general funds. And that Supply Chain and Ports Investment Package is comprised of several elements, which you can see here. The first is $1.2 billion for port, freight, and goods movement infrastructure, and that is being implemented by us here at Calsta. There's also $875 million for zero-emission port equipment and infrastructure, which will be led by the Air Resources Board and the Energy Commission. There's $110 million for workforce training, which will be led by the Workforce Development Board, $40 million to enhance California's capacity to issue commercial driver's licenses, which will be administered by the DMV, and $30 million for other operational and process improvements, which is being led by the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. There was just trailer bill language released last week that lays out how CalSTA, in coordination with Caltrans, will develop and administer this $1.2 billion for port, freight, and goods movement infrastructure. And you'll see here on the chart, you see here the objectives laid out in the trailer bill language that this funding should achieve. So you see here things like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, promoting equity, safety, resilience, those kinds of things. In addition to these objectives, we're also going to be interested in projects that meet the goals and guiding principles of the California Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, or CAPTI, as we call it, as well as the California Freight Mobility Plan. Things like reducing vehicle miles traveled, promoting social equity and safety. So there's a lot of overlap there between what you see in this chart. The trailer bill language states that 70% of the funding should support infrastructure for goods movement related to the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and 30% should go to other high priority projects that support ports and goods movement infrastructure in the rest of the state, including inland ports. The trailer bill language also notes that public agencies may partner with private operators of projects, such as freight railroads, to implement an eligible project. And furthermore, the intent of this funding, as Yatman mentioned when he was talking about the IIJA package, is to leverage this federal funding. There's a lot of money out there in IIJA, and there's also innovative financing programs available through the federal government like TIFIA and RIF. And we see this governor's package for port, freight, and goods movement to be able to leverage those federal funding and financing sources. The trailer bill language directs us at CalSTA to develop guidelines for project selection in consultation with the ports and other stakeholders. And we've just started doing that. We've had some preliminary conversations with SCAG and the ports of LA and Long Beach, but we'll be seeking more input as we develop a call for projects for this proposed funding. So that's what I had on the budget. I'm going to switch topics, but if we want, we can take some questions on the budget, or I can save questions until the end, whatever works best for the group.
Allison, do we have any questions? Anybody wanting to ask a question?
There's nothing right at this moment, but I think sometimes it takes a minute for folks to write things out in the chat or to find that raise your hand button.
Well, I'll keep going and I can take questions on everything at the end if that works. Okay, thanks. All right, so I also want to talk about our goals of advancing innovative projects. So as everyone is aware here, we have an official list of freight projects included in the CFMP 2020. And one of the criteria of those projects being listed in the CFMP was that they are all ready to list by 2025. So we know that the projects on that list are generally more traditional freight projects. There are a lot of grade separations, adding truck lanes, that kind of thing. And we're also aware that some of the innovative projects that will help us meet the goals and objectives in the CFMP and in the CTP 2050 may not be as far along in the pipeline and may not have been included in that project list. We're seeing likewise a new focus from the federal government on innovative projects and less of a focus on project readiness. So that's also something that we're taking into consideration. With the federal government in 2009, when the Recovery and Reinvestment Act was passed, there was a really strong focus on shovel-ready projects, on getting that money out to the projects that could be constructed most quickly. And with the new bipartisan infrastructure law, or IIJA, we've been hearing over and over from federal officials that they are less interested in shovel-ready projects and more interested in what they're calling shovel-worthy projects. So, you know, the federal government is recognizing, like us, that the projects that may best move the needle on our goals of reducing greenhouse gas emission and bringing about equity are not necessarily the ones that are the most ready. And we're also seeing a focus from the feds to support and fund these kinds of innovative projects to bring them farther along in the planning and project delivery process. So I mentioned this, I'm not saying that the projects in the CFMP 2020 list are bad projects. We don't believe that at all. What I'm saying is that we're aware that there are additional projects out there that are good and will help us achieve our goals, and we're going to be working to try to help advance those projects so that they can also be ready to list. I also want to talk a little bit about equity and environmental justice considerations. So in addition to advancing innovative projects, both the state of California and the federal government are shining a light on the importance of equity and environmental justice considerations on the projects that we fund and support. CalSTA, Caltrans, and the CTC have all released equity statements, hopefully you're aware of, that acknowledge the role that government and infrastructure have played in exacerbating inequities among communities. And I just want to read you some of the parts of these equity statements to kind of piece together what we're talking about here. So for example, the CalSTA equity statement says that far too often past transportation decisions quite literally put up barriers, divided communities, and amplified racial inequalities, particularly in our Black and brown neighborhoods. And then the CTC equity statement echoes this. It notes, Californians who live in historically underserved communities are more likely to be negatively impacted by increased exposure to air pollution and noise from cars, trucks, ships, trains, and aircraft, and struck or killed by drivers when walking and biking. Caltrans equity statement further notes that Caltrans recognizes their leadership role and unique responsibility in state government to eliminate barriers and provide more equitable transportation for all Californians. All the statements then go on to make a commitment that our organizations will prioritize equity. The CalSTA statement says that we will be part of the solution. We will promote policies and programs that reflect principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and will work with stakeholders to identify areas of improvement. The CTC statement says the Commission vows to create mobility opportunities for all Californians, especially those from underserved communities. And the Caltrans statement says, we will prioritize projects that improve access for and provide meaningful benefits to underserved communities. So, you know, we really want to put our money where our mouth is, to be totally frank. We're also seeing the federal government doing this. They've made equity a pillar of their policy and funding considerations. There is a new program in IIJA for reconnecting communities that's funded at $1 billion. That's looking at how we can knit together neighborhoods that were disconnected by transportation infrastructure, which are primarily neighborhoods of color. Also the RAISE funding program, which has its notice of funding opportunity out right now, that was renamed. It used to be called, it was Tiger and then Build, now it's RAISE, and RAISE stands for Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity. So it's right there in the name, what they're looking for. And the notice of funding opportunity is also emphasizing the importance of advancing racial equity as a criteria for funding. There are more examples I could cite, excuse me, but I will leave it there for now. I'm not sure, Jeannie, if you want to take it from here, or I can take some questions if there are some, and I can also try to get back on video. Sorry, I haven't been able to multitask while I was speaking to see if my internet is working again, but thank you.
No problem, Avital. Thank you so much, and especially all the points you stressed about equity being a top priority. Allison, any questions, clarifying questions that we should interject? Do you see any in the chat, or anybody have a question that they want to raise their hand for?
Yeah,
Go
we
ahead.
do have one clarifying question in the chat. This is from Jose Marquez. He just wants to know, is the 70% out of the 2.3 billion?
It's out of the 1.2 billion, the 70%. Yeah, that's just for the port, goods movement, and freight package. Thanks for that clarifying question.
Great. Well, thank you. Any other questions for Avital? I know this is exciting, another exciting funding opportunity that folks are very interested in. Well, I will jump in. I just want to kind of build off of everything Avital was just saying about encouraging innovative projects, really thinking outside the box about how we're going to invest all of this funding, both the proposed state budget funding for supply chain investment, as well as the federal infrastructure bill. Assuming that the state budget package does pass, I think that's a really exciting opportunity for us to leverage state and federal dollars together to get really the biggest benefit. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what some of those different types of investments might be, and kind of what the things that we really have in mind in terms of how we want to prioritize those investments. I think none of this will be a surprise to you, but I want to just sort of spur discussion and hopefully open it up to all of you to respond and share, things that you agree with or that you think may be missing in terms of how we're approaching this. So obviously, I think first and foremost, the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, or CAPTI, is really our guiding document for how we're thinking about this. And one of the things that's really at the forefront, in addition to addressing climate change, is addressing the health of communities and impacts to communities, particularly that are burdened by our transportation infrastructure today, reducing that impact to the extent possible. So just want to stress that up front. Communities adjacent to ports and warehousing centers are heavily impacted by truck movement, as well as truck parking. So how do we, make sure we're minimizing those impacts as we are increasing goods movement in and out of the ports and in and out of these, along these corridors. So in order to do that, I think communities really need to be centered. They need to be engaged in the process of developing those projects. So equity, is all about involving and engaging the communities. And so we need to really look for ways to elevate community voices in that process, in the planning and funding and development of freight projects. I'm really pleased to see down in District 7 on the 710 South that this is, become really, the approach that the agencies and communities are taking, along with our Caltrans district staff down there. There's a 710 South task force that is really, reimagining that corridor and putting, first and foremost, this project of, what are the principles? What are those strong principles that should be guiding the investments in that corridor to make sure that the community is benefiting from the investment, as well as the goods movement in that critical corridor. So very pleased to see that. I think that's an example that we want to look to. In addition to equity, of course, climate change is critical to us at the state. So we do want to be prioritizing, and I think we've heard loud and clear from CFAG members and partners that zero emission investment, that infrastructure investment for medium and heavy duty vehicles, as well as ships, as well as rail, is critical. We've got to clean up the emissions from all of our freight vehicles. So that's a clear priority, and we're hearing that from all of you as well. We know that is expensive investment. So I think both at the state and federal level, there's going to be a lot of support for making investments in zero emissions and really supporting the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. I think you all know as well, vehicle miles traveled reduction is a key priority as well in combating climate change. So we have been having some really important discussions at Caltrans, and I think also with all of our partners about how do we really maximize use of the existing system and avoid widening and increasing vehicle miles traveled first. So there are still cases where it may be valuable to widen the system, but we really want to prioritize optimization of the current system for the purpose, the clear purposes and benefits that we're looking for. So in this case, how do we optimize for goods movement and make sure that's sustainable without increasing passenger VMT at the same time? So it is going to require some innovation. I don't think it's necessarily a different, completely different type of investment that we haven't used before, but I think utilizing strategies, tried and true strategies, things like TSMO, transportation system management and operations, looking for more opportunities to provide, prioritization for goods movement on the existing system, but also things like inland ports. We've been in a lot of discussion about inland port projects, marine highways, port optimization types of investments, and then also increasing how we move goods on rail and take more trucks off the road to reduce emissions in that way. Just want to mention a few other things across kind of this full spectrum of needs for goods movement. Caltrans has been engaged, and I think we're nearly completed with our statewide truck parking study. So truck parking we know is a key issue and another opportunity where we want to make some really smart investments. In that study, we're recognizing how critical safety is. The data is showing us that roughly one parked truck per day is getting hit on our roadways. So that's results in a fatality roughly every 10 days. That is really appalling and needs to be centered as we're thinking about the need for truck parking. At peak hour, there's a deficit of approximately 5,000 truck parking spaces just in the highest need region. So that's another data point coming out of the study. So we've got trucks parked in unsafe locations, undesignated areas where both the driver and the traveling public are put at risk. Certainly impacts the quality of the driver's experience as well in not having a safe place to park. So parking is a critical issue that we want to be thinking about in investments. Also, the growing impacts of e-commerce and first and last mile deliveries. We've seen a huge uptick during the pandemic in online retail, and that we expect will continue to grow. And then also, I think we're seeing recently with the supply chain issues, challenges that are affecting the exports of agricultural goods. I just happened to be in our Bay Area district yesterday and had the chance to tour the Port of Oakland and heard quite a bit about the challenges with exports, particularly ag exports from the Port of Oakland. They're seeing huge challenges there, looking for creative ways to make sure we're still supporting our agricultural sector and getting those exports out. There's a huge number of jobs in our state, of course, that are supported by the agricultural sector, and those exports are really critical. And lastly, I just want to reinforce also the importance of supporting good jobs and economic development through our investments. Again, this is an area that's really been strained by the pandemic. We know there's a shortage of drivers, and that's really impacting the freight sector. So looking for creative workforce development strategies, and again, as I just mentioned, I think the agricultural sector in particular is going to be really reliant on our investments, supporting and addressing some of the labor shortages. So lots of challenges. I think the solutions are going to have to be creative and very much multi-benefit, addressing all of these issues: community impacts, climate change, job creation, and just being smarter about how we optimize goods movement on our transportation system, not just on the highways, but on the whole system. So yeah, with that, those were pretty high level items, but I just want to make sure all of those principles and ideas are kind of at the forefront, and then open it up for discussion and input from the CFAC members. So we've got about an hour remaining in our morning session, and I'd love to just invite questions for Caltrans or CalSTA, and then also input and discussion on what we've just shared. And Giles, I can also kick it to you if you want to chime in as well.
I appreciate that. No, I think you and Avital and Yaman and others covered everything. So great presentations.
Great. Well, Allison, I will ask you to facilitate then if we've got questions or hands raised, so that we can encourage some discussion here.
Thanks, Jeannie. We do have a question from Rob Ball. Rob, you are unmuted.
Thank you, Jeannie. Everyone, really appreciate you guys putting this together. The needs of rural disadvantaged communities. We have a great program, thanks to ARB through the AB 617 process. They've put together a community steering committee, and they're coming up with ideas of how to better improve all the range of air quality and health issues that they have within their community. But they specifically came up with one strategy, and that's the rerouting of trucks around their community. A lot of these small rural communities are on state highways, and those state highways funnel trucks right through the middle of downtown, right by schools, right through neighborhoods that are disadvantaged. And there is a need to figure out alternative routes that allow trucks to be rerouted. I mean, even if they're electric trucks, they still have noise and re-entrained road dust and stuff like that. We need to kind of come up with a rural rerouting process for these trucks. And a lot of these trucks are essential goods movement to their local economies, the ag-based economy within that region. So my first question is there some of these funding sources, whether it's state or federal, that could be used to help us come up with truck rerouting projects for these disadvantaged communities?
That's a great suggestion, Rob. I will look to Avital or Giles if they want to chime in on that from Kelsa's perspective, and I'm happy to share from Caltrans as well.
I might defer to on the federal side. I mean, I might defer to Avital. Avital did work at USDOT in the policy shop and on programs like on RAISE. I don't know if there may be rural set-asides in some of these programs, like infra and the RAISE program, which has a notice of funding opportunity. Now, the other thing I would say is, if there's a revenue stream associated with this, or it's something that potentially, innovative financing or programs like TIFIA might be applicable. There are certain within that program. There are for rural projects, I think, opportunities to get below Treasury rate and up to 80% cost financing, particularly if a state infrastructure bank is involved with it. So one of the things we didn't mention here is that, we have a special agreement with the USDOT Build America Bureau to get technical assistance for RIF and TIFIA programs, called an Emerging Projects Agreement, to be looking at supply chain. So that's another avenue as well But again, I was talking federal. I don't know, Avital, if you have any insights on set-asides for rural communities.
Avital may be having internet issues again. Are you there, Avital? Well, Rob, I will just chime in. I think from Caltrans' perspective, we would love to support something like that. I think maybe initially what you're talking about is just as simple as a planning study for rerouting trucks and maybe, you know, kind of operations and signage to support a more efficient flow and less impactful flow of trucks on communities. We would love to partner with you on that, especially as it impacts the state highway system. And hopefully, you know, the Caltrans district, District 6 is you're connecting with them and that they're supportive. There's a number of opportunities certainly to fund planning grants, including, as Giles mentioned, the RAISE program does have eligibility for planning grants at the federal level. And I'm not sure that this idea would necessarily be a good fit for the Reconnecting Communities program, but that's something we could certainly look at too. That's a new program emerging at the federal level as well. But we've also got a Caltrans Arch Sustainable Transportation Planning Grants, which I think many of you are familiar with. And we can fund some of our own studies with state planning and research dollars. So in terms of doing the planning work, I think we'd love to partner with you on that and find opportunities to do those studies. And then if there are investments that need to be made, I think there's probably a number of programs that could support that kind of investment to reduce impact on communities, improve goods movement through rural communities. So we can talk further offline about what some of those opportunities might be. Did you have another question, Rob? I hope that answers the first part of your question.
Yeah, and thank you. Safety is a big issue in our rural communities. You know, the accident rates on rural routes, fatality rates on rural routes are higher, much higher than in urban areas. And so a lot of the improvements that we're seeing through rural areas and around rural areas are not related to capacity, they're related to safety. And the need for more passing lanes on a rural 2-lane highway to avoid the head-on collisions. And that's just an ongoing issue related to goods movement that we need to be thinking about, is how to still keep some funding in there for capacity. And then it'd be nice if the inland ports, which are really focused on connecting to via rail to the major ports of LA, Long Beach, if that inland port service would be eligible for the 70% of the funding, since it's a part of the LA Long Beach port network. And might be nice to be some flexibility in there to allow that inland port activity to go after the 70%. That's it. I guess there weren't questions or comments.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate that. Giles, I don't know if you want to comment on that or.
Just on your last, the only thing I would comment on is just on the last point. I mean, inland ports are specifically eligible, you know, for under the governor's budget proposal, the Schiller bill language. And again, Jeannie had mentioned that, you know, it's an issue that we're actively engaged on and having discussions with regional stakeholders.
Great. Thank you, Giles. Allison, can we get to the next question or comment?
Yeah, let's see. We have a question from Mark Adams. Mark, you're unmuted. If you're unable to connect to audio, I'll go ahead and read your question. It says, are there specific funds available to air freight? LAX air cargo volume set all-time highs both in 2020 and 2021, and 2021 was up over 20% relative to 2020, which at the time was the all-time peak cargo volume. In particular, funding for electrification of airfield cargo equipment and electrification infrastructure would be helpful, as airports are often located near disadvantaged communities.
Mark, great question. I am not sure if I can answer that at the moment, but maybe we can follow up on that. I know there is quite a bit of funding in the federal infrastructure package that's going through FAA, but I've not seen the details on that. So I think most of that funding also is not going to flow through Caltrans. Will be coming direct from FAA, but we can follow up on that offline. Giles and Avital, anything you want to add from the state side or the federal side?
Just Jeannie's correct. I mean, I don't have the exact number, but a lot of money, a lot of airport improvement program grant funding came to the IIJA. And generally, that funding goes directly to the airport authorities, which are sort of municipal authorities. And I don't, historically, that funding has like been for airside, like runway type improvements. I don't know whether equipment is eligible or not. But again, like that generally the people that administer that are the airport authorities. Also passenger facility charges, which are sort of taxes on airline tickets that have more flexibility and can be used for different things. I would say potentially equipment. So that's another revenue source in aviation for that type of thing.
Yeah, I just apologize. I'm back online. I'm so sorry about the connectivity problems I'm having. Thank you, Jeannie and Giles, for covering, and apologies for being silent when you called out my name. Hopefully I'm back. Yeah, I mean, traditionally these infrastructure bills are just covering surface transportation. And so, you know, I think we need to look into if there is some eligibility for air freight, but traditionally that's been a separate funding pot.
Thanks, Avital. All right, Allison, can we get the next question or comment?
Yeah, next question comes from Chris Metzger. Chris, you are unmuted.
Yeah, I was just curious about the truck parking information, if that's readily available or if that's still to come and when we might be able to look at that.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you to answer the question on the timing.
I believe that I think we have a draft out. You know what? I hate to punt, but I think Allison, do you know? You could share them with us. I mean, it's still because there are a lot of things changing, and we add a lot more things into it. That's why I was thinking the status of it. But we could have that available to share.
Yeah, we are getting our final draft of the report tomorrow. In terms of raw data, it kind of depends on what you're looking for. We do have some usage agreements about the data. So some of it we aren't able to share, but if you message me privately, I'd be happy to help you get what you need.
Thank you.
Okay, next question is from Mike Liu. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Oops. Mike, you are unmuted.
I was just asking the question from the previous comment about inland ports. There was a 70-30 split that was calculated for Southern California. And I believe that the inland ports were considered in that split and that had gone towards the 30% portion the inland ports had.
Yeah, that's correct. That's how the trailer bill language is drafted currently, that the 30% is for other high priority projects around the state, including inland ports.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Doesn't look like we have. Oh, let's see. Do we have any other questions? Tina Backstrom, you are unmuted.
Hi, thanks. I did have a question though about the concept of the inland port versus the concept of the airport and the inland port's ability to use funding because the cargo still has to get to the airport before it jumps, before it hits the airfields and so forth. So how does that work, if at all? I know I did put a comment about partnering with local jurisdictions and so forth on funding, but how is that distinction between the inland ports versus the airports and the ability to use the funding? How does that work?
So, Tina,
Go ahead.
Oh, Avital, do you want to go?
Go ahead, Jeannie. I can chime in afterward if needed.
Sure. Well, I'll just offer, I mean, the funds that we're talking about here, both in the state transportation package as well as the federal infrastructure funds that Yatman was discussing, are for surface transportation. So I would assume, and Avital may be able to speak to this more expertly, but that ground transportation to airports would be within the realm of certainly surface transportation investment, so would be eligible under a number of these funding pots, but that the airport infrastructure itself would fall under the FAA investments and outside of the programs that we're talking about today.
Yeah. Okay.
The inland port idea is, sort of, and we may have folks on the line today too that can speak to that in more detail. I'm not sure if we've got our friends from Fresno COG here who have been really leading the feasibility study work so far, but the idea of an inland port is to sort of create an intermodal hub where you could take freight, on rail or on truck out of the seaports and into a hub. In this case, we've been discussing potentially in the Central Valley, where there's a lot of agricultural exports happening as well, and kind of concentrate opportunities for investment in whether it's warehousing or manufacturing or job training, but kind of create some, more clean technology or zero emission kind of hubs for that intermodal freight movement, rather than, the sort of more disaggregated way that the warehousing and things are being developed today. But would love to invite, Avital, please chime in on anything that I missed from your perspective, but if others are on the line that want to speak to the concept of the inland ports, I think that'd be valuable for folks here.
Yeah, that's right, Jeannie. On the federal side, the rule has pretty much been they'll pay for infrastructure leading to the airport, like they'll pay for roads, they'll pay for public transportation. I know we're a freight group, but just an example. And so definitely that freight that needs to get through the airport, that's generally an eligible expense for these kinds of funds, like up until the airport itself. And then once it gets, on the tarmac and the airplane and stuff, that's a different source of funding. Yeah, and I think with the inland port, the biggest distinction is that it's all surface transportation. It's truck or rail. It's just getting those containers or those goods out of the ports themselves and then dealing with them somewhere where there's, more space and less congestion. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Understood. I'm thinking about, I don't know if Mark is thinking along the same lines as that I'm thinking, but a cargo facility, for example. Let's say you have a large cargo hub, right? And, all of those containers and so forth, or, the smaller containers, of course, but the ones that go onto into the planes, like those need to come to a facility, that particular facility, right? And then of course they get dispersed onto the plane, but getting them to that facility, would something like that be considered eligible on the side that we're bringing from the ground, ground transportation to that facility, and then of course we know on the other side of it, it goes onto the air side, right? But that almost that intermodal facility in itself, that's collecting the cargo from the surface streets, right? The people are bringing it there with, You know, maybe I'm thinking too broad here, but do you think something like that could possibly fall into that?
I think so. It sounds, I mean, I think we need to look at the details a little bit more closely, but it sounds like something that, you know, is along the lines of what this funding should be used for, to help move freight. Yeah, Gina, I see you nodding. I don't know if you have something you want to add.
Yeah, the details are critical. I think, you know, with all the other kind of priorities and issues that we mentioned, that, you know, emissions reduction opportunity, reducing impacts on communities, you know, sort of all of those other factors are important. But yeah, I think to the extent that it's a surface transportation investment to get cargo to an airport, I would think that would absolutely be eligible under the funding programs that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for being so engaged. We have quite a few people coming up in the chat and raising their hands. I'm going to go in order of the order that you raised your hand or typed your question. So next we have Mark Adams. Mark, you are unmuted. Oh, you know what? That might be from earlier. Mark, if you still have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand. Otherwise, we're going to move on to Carrie. You're unmuted.
Yeah, just some notes on the Central Valley Shoreham Rail. The two ports, Isle Long Beach, were involved in the precursor to the ongoing phase funded by Caltrans Sustainability Grant. We provided funding for some market segmentation studies, which is actually the most critical aspect of such an endeavor. Personally, I've been involved in inland port studies for over 20 years, and several of them, the most recent one back in 2011, 2012, looking at these issues. The Central Valley, obviously, the focus there would be exports, not just one location, possibly several locations. And the imports is a challenge in that a lot of the imports moving through the Central Valley to serve the communities there, they are transloaded into domestic trailers as part of the logistics design, supply chain design of shippers. So it's a challenge to get imports, but again, the market segment is finite. It's not the sort of the panacea for solving congestion in the ports area or the 710 or throughout Southern California. It's just one type of strategy, and as was stated, economic development opportunities are being sought also in conjunction with such facilities where you might have multidisciplinary logistics operations in addition to the possibly movement of cargo via containers to and from the ports. So I just want to caution everyone that more effort and studying to be done. You also have to have a willing railroad partner, which has been the challenge in the past for inland port facilities in Southern California. So thanks.
Thank you, Carrie. Great points. Allison, let's keep going with the comments.
My mistake. Looks like one of these was intended for me offline. So with that, I think unless anyone else has something they'd like to bring up right now, I think that concludes our questions.
All right, thank you. Well, I just want to invite you know, ongoing input on this item. We'd certainly love to hear from you and follow up to the meeting. I was hoping that there would be more discussion and input here, but acknowledge that this format is a little bit challenging for open discussion. So we might think about a little bit of a different approach so that we can encourage more discussion from folks. But certainly this is a big task, figuring out how we invest all of this funding, which is you know, blessing to us certainly, in a way that's going to really provide the biggest benefits to the state is a complex task. And I think we all want to, be as aligned as we can with all of you and the work that's going on all over the state. And yeah, making sure that we're being really smart about how we're investing. So Avital, Giles, anything that you want to add in kind of wrapping up this discussion item? We can probably end our morning session early. There's nothing else.
Thank you all for your partnership and your input, and thanks for the questions. These are the kinds of things that, help us think about the best ways to shape these programs, and so appreciate all of your input on that.
Great, thank you, Avital. And if folks have suggestions too for kind of how we can, have more discussion on this at future meetings, or just, different project ideas that we should dive into a little bit more deeply. Lots of good comments about the inland ports and the considerations there. So that may be an item that we want to have more discussion on, so that we're really thinking about all the factors that go into a project like that. All right, well, with that, we're going to let you go a little bit early, give you a half hour back in your day, and we will see you all tomorrow afternoon for the second half of our CFAC meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jeannie, Avital, Giles.